Good morning, students. Welcome back. We will now continue with the paper on British Literature Survey. We looked at a poem written by one of the major voices of the 20th century, the representative 1930s poet, Winston Auden. I hope you have taken stock of the poem as an elegy, as a 20th century poem that strikes a new note in keeping with the modernism of the early years of the 20th century. We have in Auden's poem a very different elegy using different kinds of conventions in keeping with the changing times. Now, Auden is not really considered a modernist, even though you can find in his works, like the poem that we study, a lot of influence of the modernists. Auden is more technically considered as the voice of the 1930s, which in many ways, that voice was one that in many ways countered the high modernism of the previous decade, 1920s. And it is now to that decade that we now turn. We take up for discussion the work of one of the most significant figures of modernism in English literature. One who has, contributed only very few works. He's definitely not a prolific writer like T.S. Eliot was or Auden was. Both of them were extremely prolific, who had a very long span or career as writers, and who contributed as poets, as playwrights, as critics, as as spokespersons of their decades or their generations. But the writer whose work we are now going to discuss is one who has probably contributed very few works, if you go by numbers, but whose influence is as important as that of the other writers we mentioned. And that writer is, who might that be? It is James Joyce. Okay. So we'll begin our discussion on James Joyce, to do which let me make a presentation. I hope the slide is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay, fine. So this is James Joyce, the Irish novelist who's considered as one of the most significant novelists of English literature, a towering figure in 20th century English literature, and whose work, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, is what we take up for discussion. Okay, now I'm not going to give you a very lengthy introduction to James Joyce. I will give you that as your assignment for the weekend, okay? So on Monday, I'll conduct a short quiz, a quiz. I'll give you a test on a Google form, and you have to answer those questions, which will be entirely based on James Joyce's life, okay? You will have plenty of material available online on the net. I'll probably also, in the book that I posted in the classroom also, you will get a good introduction to James Joyce. So the quiz will be based on the life of James Joyce. It's something that you should read about, and that is why I will not discuss it at length, but I will make you read up on it and make you write a test, okay, or answer the quiz. Yeah. Just a second. Taking some time for the presentation to come properly. Yes, so this is James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, born in 1882, and who did not live for very long. He passed away at a relatively young age in the year 1941. But in that span, he had earned for himself the reputation as one of the most influential and innovative writers of the 20th century. It is that word innovative which is the key to approaching Joyce. I think a person who made the English novel different from what it was till then, and who thereby continues to influence writers even today. A person who gave a new turn to the English novel. That is how we will look at him to begin with. So one of the most innovative writers of the 20th century. He was an Irishman, as I told you, who is noted mainly for his experimental use of language and the exploration of new literary methods. That, in essence, is basically what modernism is all about. Modernism, which had as its credo, make it new, looking for avant-garde ways of expression in keeping with the changing times, in keeping with new knowledge, new information, new developments, and so on. And just as we remember the contributors, the innovators in the field of architecture, sculpture, music, poetry, we have James Joyce, who represents modernism. I think in his work one can find the epitome of the modernist novel. And the works that made him famous are these. You have just about 6 or 7 of them there. One of the earliest, it was a collection of short stories called Dubliners. As the title indicates, I guess you have studied one of the stories of this collection. Araby is probably a story that you are familiar with. Dubliners is a collection of short stories set in Joyce's city of birth, Dublin. He was born in a little suburb of Dublin in an area called Rudgar. That is where he was born as the first of, I think, 10 children, born to his parents. And this is a collection that is, so entrenched in the city of Dublin. It is almost like walking through the streets of Dublin. James Joyce actually wrote most of his important works not while living in Dublin. He had very strong emotional attachments to the city of Dublin, but at the same time, it was also a city which gave him a lot of pain and suffering and anxiety, as we will discover when we discuss the novel that is prescribed for our study, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which in many ways is autobiographical. It can be considered in many ways as an autobiographical novel. And even though it was while living in cities like Paris and Trieste that he wrote most of his important works, what is interesting is the way he has set each one of these works in the city of Dublin with such faithful representation of the city in all its minutest details, to such an extent that Joyce himself says, if, God forbid, the city of Dublin should one day be burnt, you can recreate the city brick by brick just by reading my works. It's not an exaggeration. It is actually quite true. The way he brings in the streets, the landmarks, the buildings, and the features of the city of Dublin. And it is almost the growth of an individual living in the city of Dublin that you can trace in the short story collection Dubliners. It begins from childhood and the final story, the dead. So it's a life that is chronicled in the course of these stories in the 1914 collection called Dubliners. This was a story, a collection that caught the attention of some of the critics, even though he did not immediately make a mark as an eminent writer. That was to happen much later. Actually, the first collection was probably a collection of poems, chamber music, that was published in 1907. There was one more poetry collection called Poems Penage, that was much later. And then he wrote a play called Exiles. But what made him famous were his novels. Dubliners, of course, came into much recognition when the later novels began to be discussed by critics and garnered a lot of attention. Now, he began work on a novel called Stephen Hero sometime during the early years of the during the early 1910s, 1911, 12, around that time, or maybe around the year 1914. So Stephen Hero was a work that he began in more or less an autobiographical manner by creating a narrative around this young boy named Stephen, whose experiences in many ways parallel the experiences that James Joyce as a young man had experienced till then. But he did not complete the work. In fact, he was quite unhappy with the way the work was progressing, and he realized that it was not turning out the way he wanted it to be presented. He decided, therefore, to write a new work and discard Stephen Hero, and that is how a portrait of the artist as a young man came up. Even in the earlier narrative, the focus was, of course, on Stephen, but it was more on Stephen Hero being looked at by the others. A very ordinary, linear narrative where you have conversations and where you have others telling you the story of Stephen Hero, or Stephen Hero being looked at by others. Now, he realized that that is not what he wanted to be told through that narrative. What he wanted was to convey how Stephen looked at the world outside. And that is how a portrait of the artist as a young man was written, which delineates the artistic growth, or the growth of this young man named Stephen Dedalus. We'll discuss that name, Stephen Dedalus, and the way he developed as an artist, or the way he grew up and became an artist. Not a painter, but a writer. So that is what a portrait of the artist as a young man is all about, which was originally published as a serialized novel in a magazine called The Egotist. So it's a very, very, very egoist, The Egoist, very significant publication of those times. And since we have to discuss the novel at length, we will just leave that point there and then talk about the next work, which was what really made him so famous. By this time he had caught the attention of the significant poets of those times, like Ezra Pound, the American Ezra Pound, who, of course, we know played a major role in giving a poem like The Wasteland the shape that we are now familiar with. And as Ezra Pound, the poet and editor, he noticed the work of James Joyce, and he realized that here is a writer of great potential who should be encouraged to write and get his work published. Now, Ulysses, the novel, which in some ways is based on Homer's Odyssey, was a novel that had a great deal of difficulty in getting published for various reasons. One was, of course, the great difficulty, that writers experienced in reading and comprehending the work, because by this time, James Joyce had become the major proponent of what we today understand as the stream of consciousness technique, a technique that we will be discussing, but one which turned away from the conventional modes of narration followed in linear narratives or third-person narratives, where you have the author telling you the story, and through conversations and through interactions between the characters, we have the story developing. Here, on the other hand, continuing the trend that he had begun with A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you have the writer taking you into the mind of the character and presenting to you not the author's point of view, but the flux, the flow of thoughts that pass through the mind of the characters. Ulysses is a novel that is, voluminous. It has just 3 characters. One of the characters of A Portrait, the same Stephen Dedalus, and then a couple, Leopold Bloom and his wife, Molly Bloom. But these 3 characters, who are in various or in many ways are supposed to be modeled on Ulysses of Homer, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus. You have these 3 characters taking you through their experiences of just one day in the city of Dublin. The thoughts that pass through the minds of these 3 characters on that day, the 16th of June, 1904, as they pass through the city of Dublin. That takes you through more or less the entire history of the journey of humankind. That is the significance of Ulysses, which is why it is often considered as one of the masterpieces of Joyce and also as one of the most significant novels ever written. It was, again, with much, as I told you, with much difficulty that it was published initially in the United States, and only then did it get published in England. Apart from the difficulty encountered because of the stream of consciousness narrative, that was only part of it. More of, charges of obscenity, and that was what posed a problem in the way of its proper publication. But with the Americans, taking to the novel in with great enthusiasm, very soon the ban on the novel was lifted in England as well, and then it was there in England, and today it remains one of the most significant works ever written. And this was followed by another work called Finnegan's Wake in the year 1939, a novel which made even Ulysses seem rather easy to comprehend, because Finnegan's Wake, it's actually a rather incomplete novel, but whether it is complete or incomplete does not make much of a difference to a person who tries to read it, because of the total stream of consciousness technique and the large amount of experimentations that the writer engages in, as a result of which it becomes a very, very difficult novel to approach. I'm sure when you try to read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you would have encountered a lot of difficulties, because it is a novel that is written so differently from novels as we are familiar with, very different from the novels of Dickens or Hardy or Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte, any of the novelists that you're familiar with. We are so used to the pattern of the conventional linear narrative. And here is somebody who takes you inside the mind of the character. A Portrait of the Artist is, a novel which uses both features. There are certain parts of it which are written in the conventional way, and then of course you have stream of consciousness passages too. But Finnegan's Wake is out and out stream of consciousness, which is why it remains one of the most difficult novels, a novel that has mystified readers, ever since its publication. So that is Finnegan's Wake. Now, therefore, these are just the works of James Joyce, which are, just a handful. But he, in these works, had taken, the novel, the genre of the novel, to another level altogether. Used language in a very, very different way and opened the doorways of experimentation, new ways of expression and innovation to other writers. And that is what made James Joyce so significant. Yeah. I told you I will not linger much on Joyce and his life, but you can just take a look at this family tree to know about his parents, John, Joyce, and Mary. And here you have a large family. I think there were about 10 children or so. He was the eldest, exactly in the way that Stephen Dedalus, in the novel that we're going to discuss, was the first among 10 children born to Stephen's parents. So you have then James Joyce and his partner, Nora Barnacle, about whom we will, of course, talk now. And he had 2 children, Giorgio and Lucia, both of them given Italian names because these children were born when the Joyces lived in Italy, in Trieste, in a place called Trieste in Italy. And that is why he named them Giorgio and Lucia. It was, I told you Nora Barnacle was his partner. It was much after the children became adults and when they had some difficulty in getting admission in some of the conventional institutions that the Joyces, James and Nora, decided to get married. Till then, they were just partners living together. And I think one must make a mention of a major writer from Ireland who played a significant role in Joyce's life, as an assistant, a secretary kind of person, because Joyce was somebody who suffered from many problems of the eye. He had a very, a series of ailments connected with his eye. And he underwent, I think, on more than one occasion, the surgical surgeries on his eye. And he needed the help of an assistant, with whom Lucia had a very, difficult kind of relationship. And that itself is something that literary critics have talked about. But that writer, in fact, went on to make a mark for himself as one of the major playwrights of all time, just as James Joyce is considered as a person who gave the novel a new direction. This person is somebody who gave the genre of drama a new direction. I'm sure you have no difficulty in guessing the identity of that person. If it is such an important dramatist, if that person is Irish, then it can only be Samuel Beckett. Okay. So you can learn more about Joyce and his life by reading up about it and writing the test next week. Yeah, but I think we can talk about Nora Barnacle, a person who Joyce met. He had proceeded to Paris for the completion of his studies, where he hoped to become a doctor. But he soon gave up on that and devoted himself entirely to writing. And it was when, in the early years, I think somewhere around 1903 or so, that he returned to Dublin because his mother was ill. Now, his father, in the Joyces were a very wealthy family to begin with. I told you that he was born in a region of Dublin called Rudgar. You know, Rudgar was one of the more um, prosperous regions of Dublin, and one that was peopled by the wealthy. But his father, who was a businessman, soon went into much of drinking habits and so on, and as a result of which, very soon the family's prospects just diminished, and uh, it is said that they had to move further and further away from Dublin. With each house that they shifted from, Joyce has recorded somewhere, the number of things that they were left with, diminished too. And ultimately, they moved to one of the remote regions of far away from Dublin. And his mother, who put up with a great deal of difficulty in looking after the 10 children, with the father's drinking habits and the financial insecurity very looming large in the household. He had great regard and respect for his mother. And it was when she was ill, only then did he decide to come back to Dublin from Paris, where he had more or less settled down and made a mark for himself as a writer of great repute. Now, when he on one of his jaunts, or as he was strolling through the city of Dublin in the year 1904, he happened to meet this woman, Nora Barnacle. You know, and that day, the day that he met was the 16th of June, 1904. And he immortalized that day by dedicating his masterpiece to that one day. In other words, the events of that novel, Ulysses, as I told you, are set on just one day. That was the day of Joyce's meeting Nora Barnacle, a woman who was to play a very important role in his life. And the letters that Joyce wrote to Nora Barnacle are themselves, rich literary works. You have two entire volumes of letters written by Joyce, most of which were written to Nora Barnacle. Extremely, what shall you say, very open kind of letters, extremely livid in his uh, expression of love to Nora. You can just read some of those letters, which are available now online, to know the kind of liberties that he took with the language. It is the same kind of liberty that you find him using in novels like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Not so much in a portrait, even though here and there you find glimpses of that kind of liberty that he takes with the language. Anyway, that day is what enthusiasts of Joyce observe even today as Bloomsday. Every June, in every year in the month of June, on the 16th, you have Joyce enthusiasts taking out processions and parades celebrating that day. It is known as Bloomsday. And there are very interesting rituals and customs associated with Bloomsday. His fans dress up as these characters, as either Leopold Bloom or Molly Bloom and Stephen Dedalus, and they walk through the city of Dublin, taking exactly the route that was covered in the novel. I've put up there a map for you to see. These are the landmarks that the novel refers to: the buildings, the places, the streets, the pubs, and so on. And you have these people reading out passages from the novel, going to the very same pubs and taverns that are described in the novel, and generally taking the same route. It's a custom that was begun sometime during the 1920, very soon after the publication of the novel, in fact. Even when Joyce was alive, this tradition had begun, and he's written about it to some of his friends also. And every year it's an annual ritual. It was only broken last year because, of course, um, the pandemic during they could not take out the customary processions, but they still did the Bloomsday observation online. Okay, so that is about Bloomsday. You can just see how huge an event it is. This is where the novel ends and where the Bloomsday participants also finish their walk in the city of Dublin. They read out passages from the novel too, in observation as they observe this day. Yeah, so I think we can now take a look at James Joyce as a novelist. As I told you, in every field of art, in sculpture, in building, in architecture, in music, in poetry, in painting, you have new figures emerging and expressing themselves in painting. You can think of the works of Picasso, for example, a person whose work really epitomizes modernism. Think of a painting that you might be the Cubist paintings of Picasso. You can think of a painting like Guernica, where you have the depiction of the Spanish Civil War. But unlike a normal painting, a normal painting would be like a linear narrative in fiction. You do not have a realistic representation there at all, but you have, I hope you're familiar with the painting, Guernica, Guernica. If you are not, please do check it up. I'm sure you are. Well, yeah, that just shows the new way of responding to the Spanish Civil War. That is just an example of that. In fiction, one of the major innovations that modernism brought in its wake was stream of consciousness, not telling the story as it is conventionally told, not following the linear pattern. What is a linear pattern? You can draw the narrative on a line which has a proper beginning, a middle, and an end. It proceeds as a line would do in a linear fashion. But here you have a total disregard of the linear narrative, and you have instead the author taking you into the mind of the character and giving you a flavor or a feel of the thoughts as they pass through the minds of the characters, the confused flux of the thoughts. That is what is presented there for your perusal. It is said that it's like looking at the mind of a character as you would do through a peephole, or a keyhole. It's like looking into the room through a keyhole. It gives you a new perspective altogether, and that is exactly what the stream of consciousness technique also does, which is sometimes also known as an interior monologue, because what you have is the monologue, the voice of a single voice, therefore a monologue. But then it is not what is spoken outside, but what passes through the mind of the character. Now, we need not think that it was James Joyce who actually began the trend of the interior monologue. No, he was a novelist whose works made the stream of consciousness so famous and so much reckoned. He, along with Virginia Woolf, they were writers who gave so much of visibility to this new way of writing. But he himself, James Joyce himself, has said that he was actually following the track laid by a French writer, Edward Dujardin, who used these interior monologues in novels like, a French novel, the name of which I have put up there on the slide, La Lauria Sans Coupe, which means Wheel to the Woods No More, an 1888 novel. But when you look at it, therefore, you can find that kind of interior monologue going back, even in some of the earliest novels, even in a novel like Don Quixote, for example, Cervantes' Don Quixote, centuries before these novels were written. Even there, you may actually find traces of the interior monologue or the stream of consciousness. It's just that the term became more famous with the introduction of the term by an American psychologist named William James. In his work, The Principles of Psychology, written in 1890, William James was, of course, the brother of the American novelist Henry James. In Henry James's novels, also you may find traces of stream of consciousness. He's not a writer who falls, just in the slot of a linear narrative novelist. There are passages which may, have resemblances with the stream of consciousness. Anyway, it was William James who actually coined the term stream of consciousness. And today we understand the stream of consciousness as a narrative technique in fiction, which is intended to present the flow of thought, of the myriad, the many impressions, visual, auditory, physical, associative, subliminal. And it's not what you see, it's what you feel, what you touch, what you hear, what you smell, all of these that have an effect on the consciousness of the character. And these form part of his or her awareness along with the rational thoughts. So that is what stream of consciousness is. And Joyce himself, as I told you, said that he was following the path laid by the French writer Edward Dujardin. And what did Joyce do in order to make it so recognized? He carried the interior monologue one step further by rendering not just the impressions, the half thoughts, associations, lapses, the hesitations, all of these, all those. It's not just what you feel and what you see and what you can hear and smell, but apart from that, the hesitations, the anxieties, the worries, the impulses, all of these are also brought into the narrative. All of these form part of the individual's conscious awareness along with his or her rational thoughts. And that is how it became such an innovative way of telling a story, bringing it to a new point or a new perspective altogether. So that is, we'll be discussing that in the course of the novel. But I think it is in a novel like Ulysses that, you find the stream of consciousness technique coming to the height that it today has achieved. So it is hailed as one of the finest novels ever written. The way Joyce has made use of the language and put it to such innovative uses, shows his genius as a writer. But it also, as I told you, paved a new way for novelists, other novelists. And there were many points at which people had predicted the death of the novel. But whenever you have that kind of a prediction of the death of a novel, you would have a writer like James Joyce emerging and breaking new ground. And that is what he did with novels like Ulysses. Now, we don't need to discuss Ulysses, we need to focus on a portrait. But at the same time, one cannot, imagine discussing Joyce without talking about Ulysses, which, as I told you, is set on a single day in the city of Dublin. And, it's about just, I think we can just talk about the last chapter, which is written in the form of just 7 paragraphs with absolutely no punctuation. In that chapter, you have the thoughts of Molly Bloom, for example, some 42 printed pages or so. It's just one long sentence with no full stop, that the thoughts that pass through the mind of Molly Bloom in that novel. So the 3 characters, Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Molly Bloom. Yeah, so you can read up about about Ulysses on the slide and do some further reference also. I think I have given stream of consciousness as one of the audit course topics. I think so. Yeah, I think somebody worked on it. In any case, when you do your assignments and seminars, I'm sure this topic will again come up. So we'll have more discussions then. For the moment, I think we can look at the novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Look at the title, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It does not make a mention of the artist himself. The central character here, as I told you, is a person named Stephen Dedalus. But it is not the name Stephen Dedalus that is uh, used in the title. So it could be any artist, a portrait of any artist. This would exactly be the kind of journey that any artist would undergo in order to become an artist. And then look at the article associated with portrait. A portrait. It is just a portrait. In other words, it is not the portrait. The, is not the article that is used. If that were the article that was used, it would mean that this is the only, it's like a photograph. This is the real or the only depiction of this artist's journey. On the other hand, here the writer says this is just one of the many possible portraits. A portrait. This is just one portrait. You can have any number of portraits. That is why it's not a photograph or an image or anything. It is a portrait. It is somebody's attempt, to depict the journey of this character, the journey that made him an artist. So that is the significance of a portrait of the artist as a young man. So what happened in his youth in order to lead him towards his future as an artist. That is what the novel tells us about. And in many ways, it is autobiographical. As I told you, it almost the various incidents that are depicted in the novel are in many ways parallel to the incidents in Joyce's own life, as we gain knowledge of it from the various biographies of Joyce. So it is a semi-autobiographical novel. It traces the intellectual and emotional development of this young man named Stephen Dedalus, and it takes you to that point where he finally decides to leave the city of Dublin, leave Ireland altogether, and proceed to Paris, the city where he believed he would have the freedom that an artist was inevitably in need of. Dublin, was a place that he found restricted him in many ways, in his family, in his political life, in his artistic life, at various levels. This was a city that restricted his freedom as an artist. And that is why, like the seagulls that you have depicted in the last chapter, who are seen flying in the sky, this character also decides to fly away to Paris. So it is a flight that the novel ends with. The author's feelings are represented through that last one line. Welcome, O life, I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. So he's speaking like any other artist, the millions of artists who have done this, soared high in order to dedicate themselves to art and create art. That is what he does in this novel, and which is why you have the title, or the name of the character, Stephen Dedalus. Yeah, as I told you, it was composed over the course of 7 years. Initially, it was written as Stephen Hero, but then he decided that that was not how he wanted the journey of the artist to be traced, and which is why he later rewrote it in the form that we are now familiar with. And which is why, it cannot be considered as a mere Bildungsroman. A Bildungsroman is one that traces the growth of an individual. But when that individual happens to be an artist, you have another specific term used for that. That is what is known as Künstlerroman. These are both German terms. I'm sure you're familiar with the German term Bildungsroman. Roman is a story, Bildungs, a story of growth, one that traces the growth of an individual. Most of the novels that we are familiar with, whether it is Great Expectations or Jane Eyre, all of these are novels of growth. They trace the growth of the central character. But when that central character happens to be an artist, as it is in this novel, as it is in so many other novels, you call such novels Künstlerromans. Yeah, so this is the Künstler, a typical example of a Künstlerroman, novel about the development of an artist whose early manifestation appears, yeah, as I told you, in the surviving fragments of Stephen Hero. He abandoned that in a year or so after he began writing, and then he wrote the portrait as it is now familiar to us. Now we'll just, I will not linger. Yeah, it's almost 1 hour now. We can't finish the novel in any, I mean, case in the course of just, half an hour or so. So I will do that on Monday if you are free on Monday. But I'll just give you just an introduction to the name of the central character, Stephen and Daedalus. Stephen is the central character here is named Stephen, probably after Saint Stephen, the first martyr of, according to the Christianity. So he is somebody who was martyred. Saint Stephen was martyred. He gave up his life for the sake of his faith. And similarly, Stephen is somebody here who gives up everything for the sake of art. He gives up his life. He gives up his life in the sense he gives up his family. He gives up his country of birth. He gives up his relationships and everything in order to dedicate himself fully to art, exactly in the way that Saint Stephen had dedicated himself entirely to his faith. And he embraced death. He accepted death in order to die for the protection of his faith. And that is what Stephen does too. But the more interesting name is that of Daedalus. And that is the name of a figure from mythology. We are familiar with Greek mythology, where you have Daedalus as the artificer who was summoned by King, the king of Crete, in order to fight the Minotaur. The Minotaur was a half animal, half human kind of demon. And in order to slay the Minotaur, Daedalus was appointed. And he did that by creating this labyrinth, a huge maze around the Minotaur. And that is how the Minotaur was finally trapped and killed. But then they themselves had to, they themselves could not escape from the labyrinth. And that Daedalus and his son Icarus, he did that by creating wings for them. It is from that creation of the wings that you have Daedalus always, used as a symbol of art, the power of art to fly high in imagination. That is, using the wings of imagination, an artist has the power to fly high above the labyrinth of reality. Reality, that which you are trapped in is like a labyrinth. It's like a maze in which you are trapped. But using the power of your imagination, you can fly high and, reject the conventions of that terra firma or that reality. And that is what he did. But as he gave the wings to his son Icarus, he had told him, do not fly too near the sun. Your waxen wings will melt away. But Icarus, as the artist who was filled with pride and arrogance, defied his father's instructions, flew too near the sun, and that is how he fell. The wings melted, the sun's rays melted the wings, the waxen wings, and he fell down dead, as we saw in that painting in the other day, in the painting drawn by Peter Bruegel. Yeah, and which was referred to by Auden in that poem. In any case, this is Daedalus, therefore, the one who represents art in the way that he flies high out of the labyrinth with the help of his wings. So that is how the central character in the novel is named after the first Christian martyr and the heavenly artificer, Daedalus. Okay, so we'll discuss the novel in the next class. Okay?
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. Yep, so please do read up on James Joyce. and take the quiz next week. In the meantime, you can also discuss the test and tell me the suitable dates next week when you can have it. Okay. Please feel free to tell me whatever you want regarding the test. It's raining quite heavily here. I don't know if you have rains there too. Anyway, we'll wind up now.